Welcome to Unexpected Journey, where each week top professionals share work wisdom and life lessons and what they have learned about human experience in the workplace. I'm your host, AnneBibb. This week we have John Riordan. John is the chairman of Grow Remote. He is based out of Cork, Ireland. He's recently retired as the director of support for Shopify and has served as the chairman of Shopify International. Now, John has spent a lot of his career in contact centers and often referred to as the Godfather of remote. And he does talk quite candidly sometimes, and sometimes a little colorfully, to be honest. He can get a little spicy. So apologies in advance to anyone who is easily offended, but you're likely to hear some pretty candid and direct opinions from John, which is one of the reasons many of us love him. So without further ado, Mr. John Riordan, everybody.
Thanks for having me, Anne.
Great to have you. We've known each other a long time. And one of the things that I want to point out is it's actually Riordan.
Correct.
You corrected me on that.
Yeah.
A lot of people say it wrong. Yeah,
it gets butchered by quite a lot of people. Easiest way to remember it is put E's in the place where all the vowels are. So pronounce it R-E-E-R-D-E-N.
Thought you were going to go someplace else with that. So You did it very nicely. So we've known each other for a long time, really mainly through the remote work industry, the remote work world. So I'm really interested in your take on, as a global workforce, I know it hasn't ended, but as we're emerging on the other side of this, really wanting to go back to face-to-face.
Well, I'm going to break it out. The first is 2000 to 2020. The next is a 2-year period where we saw 20 years worth of growth, which is 2020 to 2022. And then the third one is the unknown of the future. So if you look back to that first period that I'm talking about, let's call it from the turn of the century, 2000 to 2020, and you look at the evolution of work from home, it used to be called teleworking. It was typically a very niche thing. Where I first came across it was where it was being used as an opportunity to get folks who were out of the workforce, typically those who were disabled, in the very early days. And if you go back and if you trace this in terms of the percentage of people who were actually working remote, you're talking about less than 1% of people were working fully remote at this stage in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it was really, really that niche. So where I got involved in it was we were looking to expand the workforce. And we came across a company that had been dealing quite heavily with those marginalized communities, particularly in the state of Florida, who'd moved there, who still wanted to work, but really didn't have that opportunity to do so. So that was the very early stages. But how that evolved, very quickly, companies that engaged with this workforce saw a couple of quantifiable and serious differences. They saw a difference in performance, as in the performance was as good, if not better, than existing contact centers. And one of the reasons for that, in fact, amongst the reasons for it were, number one, the caliber of the individual, because you were typically getting somebody who was more experienced, who had more work experience and had more life experience and was able to be calm and composed on the phone, which was a very important thing in the contact center space. Another aspect was the element of retention, because if you're bringing work into somebody's home, the likelihood that there's an alternative for them elsewhere back in those days was pretty slim. So once you had that person working for you, you almost had a moat around them, and they were essentially tied to you and you to them, but it was mutually beneficial. And the third element of it was job satisfaction. Many of these folks had been on the margins and were now getting work essentially piped to them. And that was bringing a tremendous amount of job satisfaction. But wrap all of that up, and you still had a group of people who were so small, they were not making a dent on the greater workforce. Shortly afterwards, kind of in the 2002, 3, 4 timeframe, there were 4 or 5 companies in the US that were leading the march on this. And some of the names people might remember. There was a company called Willow CSN, which became Arise Virtual Solutions. There was a company called Alpine Access based in Colorado. There's a company called LiveOps based in California. And all of them had different types of business models. And they worked with a variety of mainstream companies, your Disneys, your Carnival Cruise Line, Virgin Atlantic, AT&T, Home Depot. I mean, a lot of the major brands were using them. However, the crucial thing was it never got above about a 4 to 4.5% penetration of the overall workforce. So really that first 20-year period didn't really make an overall dent. And as late as like early 2020, let's call it Jan, Feb, just before the pandemic hit, you still couldn't post a job on most recruitment websites without stating the actual office location. So that would indicate to me that this had yet to become mainstream. I'll give you an example. I had joined Shopify at this stage, and Shopify customer support organization was 100% remote. Now, it constituted about 35 to 40% of the overall workforce of the company, but that 35 to 40% were all remote. The rest of the company was all office-based. So from my own perspective, I was the first person at Shopify at the director level who was fully remote. And I was consistently being asked by people, oh, which office do you work at? And I mentioned to them I was remote. No, but which office are you aligned with? This one, here. So people weren't getting it. So that was the first, let's call it the first era, was that 20-year period. The next
I remember it being like a huge thing a few months into the pandemic when LinkedIn added the option to put remote or as an option when the job posting, because it had never been like, and it was kind of an aha moment of why had it never been there before?
But it took a lot of whining and complaining from a lot of people in the remote workspace to get that change to happen. Right now, we would look back and you'd almost laugh at it. But to think that it actually, I mean, they had to be pushed to do it. It wasn't an automatic. So that was the first 20-year period. The next 20-year period was basically what happened in 2 years. We had this massive condensed period of ridiculous growth where the percentage of people working remote went from 5% to about 60-odd%. It was the worst possible scenario. You had a global pandemic. You had, significant health issues all over the world. You had a massive amount of lockdown. You had some industries who were just on fire and some industries that were burnt to death. Mad stories, like we've all heard the stories of outsourcers where people were jumping on motorbikes with a monitor under one hand and a hard drive under the other and heading home to somewhere else other than their BPO site. You had situations where vendors were commandeering every taxi in a town and literally saying, we will take every taxi you have for the next 2 or 3 days because we want to ship the equipment that we have in the office to people's homes. You had this massive, crazy, wild change. And let's be really honest about it. We weren't ready for it as a society. We weren't ready for it as an industry. Those of us who had been, I suppose, like heretics, been shouting about it from the rooftops for many years, we weren't even ready for the speed of the change that was required.
We weren't ready for the pandemic because the pandemic wasn't just work from home. It was a pandemic. It was a completely different situation. I talked to you several times over the pandemic, and both of us struggled. And we had worked from home for 20 years. And that was because we couldn't leave the house. So, I remember you telling me when your son went to school and you could hardly even get together, but you could get together and stay apart and walk. We as humans are not meant to do this.
You're not dealing with normality. And the reason why it's important to say that, I know people are saying, God, that's totally obvious. But we were not in normal times. So suddenly we're working in a very different way from home with jobs that many people had been doing in offices. Now they're doing them from home. And while we were able to get it done, and a lot of companies have stayed open because they were able to make that shift. But please don't look at what's happened over the last 2 years as the proper case study for remote work, because the proper long-term sustainable method of working remotely from home is still evolving. Some companies are very good at it. Even the companies that are very good are really evolving at a pretty fast rate. And I would just say, be patient, because there's a lot more change coming. Now, the pace of change is going to be different and it's going to be a lot more considered. One fascinating thing about this is the amount of technology patents that have been filed since April 2020 that refer to remote work should give all of us a cause to be tremendously optimistic about the future. There are a lot of things coming that I can guarantee you. So 2 years has been 20 years condensed. Now, where are we? Okay. So what are we doing right now? And the challenges are communication protocols. We still don't know how to communicate. We still are working out how to do proper performance management. And we still have companies who think performance management is a byword for monitoring. And I would say anybody who's out there who thinks that they should be monitoring their people using the cameras and all this sort of stuff, you're missing the whole point, because the thing that underpins everything that we're doing is the most important word in business, which was oft forgotten in the live or in the real world, and that's the word trust.
I was about to say it's trust, isn't it?
And I would always say to people, Anne, and you and I have had this conversation on many occasions, you got to think of the day when you sat opposite somebody and you were giving them a job offer. And at that moment, before you handed over the job offer, you were going, I really trust this individual. I trust them so much that I'm going to hire them. What typically happened in companies was that the mistrust started the minute the ink was dry on the thing, because it's like, now I'm going to tell you what you need to do. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. And I'm going to tell you how high to jump. We need to get back to the days of trust. And I think the last 2 years has enabled more enlightened leaders to actually be less of a command and control type leader and more of a trusting leader. So it's that level of acceptance. Now, there's another aspect to all of this, which is the mental health and the burnout. And I get a little bit triggered in this when I hear people blame remote work as the issue. For God's sake, we went through a pandemic for crying out loud. That impacted all of us, and the social mores that existed during the pandemic is what challenged a lot of us from a mental health perspective. Remote work didn't help. Okay. But I don't
it
think
didn't help, but it wasn't the cause.
It wasn't the cause. In fact, in many cases, remote work was part of the solution, because it enabled you to be pretty deeply occupied for anywhere from 7 to 10 hours a day. But ultimately, it boils down to trust. And I think the what comes out of that 2-year period is, to me, a battle of data versus opinions. And I also refer to that as a battle between vested interests and neutrals. I'll give you an example. Office space, corporate real estate. If you look at anything that's out there now talking about corporate real estate, I'd ask you to have a look at who is either citing the opinion or the research. I go and have a look to see who's actually sponsoring the information. And if you see it's coming from somebody who's got significant interest in the real estate business, or is a real estate broker, or is sitting on a variety of leases that have many years to run and they're costing them a couple of $1 million, that opinion is somebody who has a lot of skin in the game and has a I'm going to refer to it as a vested interest. What I am far more likely to lean into are people who are more academic in nature and more neutral in nature, and who are willing to present the data rather than presenting an opinion and then trying to look for data and bits of data to attach to the opinion to make the opinion look good.
Recently, there was an article about a group of people. They found an old school, paid $100,000 for this school, and turned the school into, I think, 35 apartments, and then started renting those apartments out, which was brilliant. It was a huge return on investment. And I'm wondering, why aren't we doing that with some of these commercial real estate properties that are now sitting empty for 1, 2, 3 years? Why aren't we? Because there's a huge homelessness issue. Yeah. Especially in America.
There's a homelessness issue in many parts of Europe as well. And there's a massive amount of migration in Europe that is both economic migration and shaped by wars. So there's a huge amount of flux. But I'm going to chastise you here, Anne. Apologies in all of this, okay? In the same way that you and I would recoil when we hear real estate folks telling us how to do remote work. Here we are as a bunch of remote work.
We're talking about why aren't they doing one thing?
However, I completely agree with you in that, there is going to be fallout from the push towards more remote work. And what I would love to see is far more enlightenment as to how we use space, because office space, look at this has caused a really serious conversation about the 4-day work week. Okay.
Yes.
And in many cases, and if you look at some of the key research we're really gone down to about a 2.5 day work week in a lot of industries, as in 2.5 days in the office and 2.5 days at home. So keep in mind, let's do some mathematics here for a second. 168 hours a week. A typical office building would be open 5 days a week. And let's just be nice and say 11, 12 hours a day. Okay. So let's say it's open 60 hours a week out of 168. Okay. That is, a little bit shy, but we're talking about 35% approximately of the time the office is open. So 65% of time the office is empty. Okay. So nothing is happening for that 65%. So you as the CFO are signing a check every month for something that's empty and not providing any value 65% of the time. Ooh, now it's even less valuable because people are only in half of that time of the 35%. They're only in 17% of the time. So now you have an asset where you're basically wasting it 83% of the time. Now, when you do the simple math on that, at some stage, there's going to be an enormous wake up on the use of space. What's going to happen with all of this? There's going to be, to the exact point you led into, there's going to be a significant change in the use of space. We all see it in our worlds where the most important thing when you have a distributed workforce are the intentional times that you bring people together. Now, those intentional times require space. And so in many cases, companies will take their space, they'll probably condense it down into a more meaningful size, and then they will use that space to almost be like a permanent off-site space. So really, one of the things that we regularly talk about is the old school off-site has now become an on-site because the actual office almost no longer exists. So the old school office has become the off-site location. And that's really interesting.
No, it really is. And I talked to two companies this week. One who is having exactly the experience that you just mentioned. Their headquarters, they've realized, is now too large. So they are looking to downsize. So they're moving to a much smaller location. They just don't need that much space. And two, another one who's doing exactly that with regard to on-site. They are moving to a smaller location. Only a few people are coming into the office regularly. However, their future off-sites will be on-sites, and they have hot desks for people that want to come in. And it has like a pool table, a coffee area, places for people to just come in and relax when they want to, when people come into town, things along those lines. Very much that not a cohabitation, but a place to co-locate and to hang out together.
Well, you're bringing us into the discussion about the next phase, really, which is, let's call it the future. So I talked about that first 20-year period, and then I talked about the 20-year period that happened in 2 years. Now let's talk about the future. So, you had people's response to all this massive amount of change was terms like quiet quitting and all that kind of stuff. Well, look, that's always existed. Those with a bit more of a unionistic trait would refer to that as a worked rule, which is, I'm only going to do the minimum amount of work. So, but suddenly that was being brought into, let's call it the professional kind of information worker lexicon. So that's always existed, but now it's happening at a different level. Another one is this whole RTO, return to office, and what that actually means. Mm-hmm. And one thing to be very clear, no amount of ice cream trucks and no amount of bull BS coffee machines is going to cause people to actually get back in their cars and commute 45 minutes a day in gnarly traffic or more just because the man or the woman says so. It's just not.
I can't remember the last time I heard the word gnarly, John.
Yep. But look, one of the classic manifestations of rank stupidity.
It's like heinous. Gnarly and heinous. It's been like a good 25 years since I've heard either of those.
Now, seeing as you're talking about gnarly and heinous, I'll go back to the real estate market for a second. There have been some very interesting things in the real estate market in the last couple of weeks. You've seen companies like Facebook, who I refuse to refer to as Meta, but Facebook in many countries and cities around the world are actually walking away from occupying. They have long-term leases, but they're subletting a lot of the space. What does that say? To me, it is the canary in the coal mine. This is the canary that's fallen over and dropped dead. Nobody's actually realized it yet. It'll take a while for the knock-on impact to be felt by a lot of other people. But if I had any spare cash right now, I wouldn't be putting it into what we would refer to as old school, mainstream commercial real estate. Real estate will change, and the application, as we said a while ago, the application and the type of real estate will change. And all of that grade A and grade B real estate will always be beneficial, because the companies that do want an element of going back and do want that new type of space will actually go for the expensive, nice space. What's going to happen is the C and D and E rated space, the pretty crappy space, is actually going to be the ones where the opportunity is going to be for a lot of, as you mentioned, people to go in and actually repurpose that space. Because there's one massively interesting part about this, and there's a lot of data available on this, but the average expense of having an employee working in an office in a central business district in the first world is $20,000. So companies, by virtue of actually eschewing the need to have employees in an office, are saving 20 grand per employee per year. Now, think of how much money companies have been putting of that 20,000 companies have been investing back into the employees in the last couple of years. And it's less than, so let's say the last two, just take the last two years. Has each person who's been working full-time remotely, have you felt that your company has actually trousered that 40 grand, that average 40 grand, or have you felt that that company has invested in your equipment? Is your lighting, is the lighting for your video calls good? Is your camera good? Is your microphone good? Do you have 2 monitors? Do you have a standing desk? You take all of the things that I just mentioned there, and you could probably have a fabulous, fabulous homework setup for a drop in the bucket of the overall cost savings. Now, I know people will say, yeah, but people are working in small apartments and whatever. Yeah, you can't change that immediately. But over time, what's going to happen? People aren't going to move to a city to live in a shoebox where they are not able to work from home if they have a choice of actually having the same quality job somewhere else. And some of the great research has shown that the people who are gravitating towards work from home faster are actually city dwellers. And the larger the city, the more likely they are to work from home. So it's kind of counterintuitive, right? You would expect that in the smaller towns and the rural communities, people would eschew the place of employment and stay at home. But no, it's in the cities. And the primary reason, Anne, is it's a rejection of the commute. Why would I get involved in that commute when I don't have to? If I live in a small town in the Midwest and I can just jump in my car and I can be in the office in 15 to 20 minutes, I can get, I can get the equivalent of a kind of an immersive home working experience with a tiny, with an acceptable commute.
And what this is a pretty wild and crazy idea, but of that 20 grand per person, what if just a fraction of it was given back to the employees on their salary, and then pocketed the rest? That's just a wild idea.
Okay, and I'm going to give you an even wilder one, which I'm sure you'll come back at me with, is if you were doing that job in 2019 for that salary, and you're doing the job now in 2022 for roughly the same salary, the same type of job, I don't think you should be getting any extra money. Okay, but I think the company should be investing some of the savings. Should actually come back to you in terms of the equipment, so you have everything you need to do the job. Because remember, in a lot of cases, what will get thrown back by companies is, hang on a second, if I was paying you San Francisco salary and you've moved to Arizona, I want to downsize you to an Arizona salary. And see, I don't agree with that either.
I don't agree with that at all.
Exactly. So I don't agree. That's why I don't agree with upping the salary, nor do I agree with bringing the salary down. That's the point I'm trying to make. The salary is what the salary is, and over time, the market will dictate what the correct rate for that job is. And I know that's not a popular opinion, but you didn't bring me on here for popular opinions.
I didn't bring you on here for popular opinions. I brought you on here because you're spicy. That said, I do think that a lot of companies are not giving cost of living increases year over year, and that they should be given.
Oh, I completely agree with you. So let's rephrase the question. Of that approximate 20 grand, and it's different for all companies. Assuming that the company is able to make the savings from a decrease in expenses, and many of them aren't because they're stuck with a lease, but over time they will.
Right.
What I would look for is what is the company doing with that additional money? Are they investing it in my equipment? Are they investing it in the benefits that they're providing? Do I now have, for example, are they affording me an allowance where I can go and work in a co-working hub when I need to? Are they requiring me to do a little bit more travel? So we're doing 3, 4, 5 offsites during the year. Yes, that's a big positive. Like, in other words, none of us want to see a situation where Scrooge is greedily shoving 20 grand into their back pocket. That's not what we're looking for. I want the ability for my work from home to be enhanced with the right equipment and with the right ability for me to collaborate when needed and to collect when needed. And when I work for a company that pays me a correct salary and isn't trying to take money away from me because I'm now not living in a let's call it a high cost city, and I can see that they're investing in me, I'm happy.
Yeah, I agree. So one of the things that you and I are really passionate about is, and I think Ireland has really done a very good job about this recently, is impact sourcing. So for our listeners that are not familiar with what impact sourcing is, it's where you're actually trying to source from nonprofits, or you're trying to source from, from marginalized groups or from underrepresented groups of individuals. And you actually, when we were talking, you called this community inclusion. And I loved that term. So I'd really like to hear some of how this is happening in Ireland and how it could impact employee experience and customer experience.
Sure. Full disclosure, you mentioned it in the bio. I'm chairman of an organization called Grow Remote. So Grow Remote started in 2018, and just a group of people who were trying to work out what's the best way to get good jobs to more remote places in Ireland. And what started off as just a kind of a WhatsApp group of people spitballing about how to do it became a very, very significant organization quickly. So what we try to do is we want to be the glue. We want to be the connective tissue that at the local level binds people. It binds prospective employees who actually want to work remote, that it binds the employers who actually want to hire remote workers. And critically, it binds the communities who actually want to attract people to live there. Now, it shouldn't really be viewed as, hey, everybody, let's leave the city and move to a small town. But for some people, that actually is what remote work is. Like I referenced earlier on some of the great research that's been done that showed that the people who are more likely to avail of remote work are actually people who live in cities. The derivation of that resource is probably one of the most important bits of research or bodies of research that's done on the whole remote space. And it's wfhresearch.com. And it's the amalgamation of a variety of really high-end academic pieces of research that are coordinated by a guy called Nick Bloom and his team, who bring all of the proper research and academic research together on work from home. They've shown that remote work is not working from a remote place. Remote work is actually the desire to be flexible in where you choose to work. So the hardest thing about remote work is that it's kind of genericized as a word, when a lot of people think it's I'm living with Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber types in the remote middle of nowhere. That's not what it's about. It's about choosing the flexibility of working from where you want to work. Now, bring that back down to the whole community thing that you talked about. If you are living in a smaller community, the impact of your job, particularly people in the, let's call it the knowledge space, the impact of your income in a smaller town is magnified, it's amplified. The ones and the twos make a difference. When those ones and twos become fives and tens, they make a material difference. And it's the difference between the main street having buildings boarded up and not boarded up. And that's the most incredibly important thing here, is to make sure that communities have that level of vibrancy. I'll never forget, Anne, many moons ago, one of the cities I was in North America that I visited when I was working there, that stuck with me was Vancouver. And Vancouver had this weird, there was kind of a weirdness about Vancouver. No, not because it's a weird place, but it's because it's a fantastic place. But the place was vibrant in the evening and it was quiet during the day. When I asked around, people were like, well, yeah, a lot of people tend to live here and work in the suburbs. And it was, to me, that's so much more of a beautiful way to live.
That's reversed in a lot of areas.
Exactly. So like take Manhattan's a great example. I mean, it's like you have to go through hell on earth with another, 8 to 10 million people to get in and out of Manhattan every single day. No wonder people are choosing not to do it when they don't have to do that. I mean, imagine what it's like in the, 17 countries in China that are more than 10 million people. All right, it's just crazy. So there is an aspect that's ready-made now for us to put community back into community. And what that means is that what we should all be doing is making remote work much more of an acceptable phrase and expression. We should be talking in schools about not work as being an office and a place where you'd go to, but work as being a thing that you do, and it can be in a flexible area. Because you want somebody in small town Arkansas to be able to access the same level of job as somebody who's living in a suburb of, living in a commutable suburb in New Jersey. And because once you do that, what you're actually doing is you are providing a democratization of work opportunity. And that's what's needed. That will help communities grow.
A democratization of work opportunity. What a great phrase. I think I might use that somewhere.
Please do.
But John, your name really means something in the call center industry, in the outsourcing industry, in the remote industry. You just have made your mark. And there are a lot of people that say or think, they want to be like you because of what you have accomplished. What is your advice to them when they're out there thinking, gosh, I want to take this trajectory. I want to do what John has done?
Well, first of all, I'd say stop smoking what you're smoking, if that's how you think. But anyway, no, thank you very much. It's a wonderful compliment, and I will accept it in the gracious manner in which it's meant. The things that I do and that I try to do. The first one is I try to be honest and not sugarcoat things, which means just be a little bit raw, and I'm happy with being raw, and in my opinions, and I'm happy with that. What it takes over time. Not everybody's going to like you. That's okay, but there's a really wonderful, soft, fluffy underbelly to it, which is that those who are really comfortable with it, and you with them, those relationships are massively rewarding. And I suppose it boils down to the quality of those relationships rather than the quantity of the inane relationships that you have where you just Mr. Vanilla. So, don't be vanilla. Don't be mint chocolate.
Mint chocolate.
I'd also say recognize people who you vehemently disagree with and then lean into them and try to get an understanding as to what their opinion is. Because in that way, you avoid the echo chambers. And apologies for bringing politics into it, but I look to my east and to my west from Ireland with what's happened with Brexit in the UK and what's happened in the last couple of years in the US. And what I've seen is actually, I'm going to refer to it as sort of a breakdown in democracy to a certain extent. And when you look at it, the way in which the various media outlets have immediately decided to be red or blue, right or left. And there really isn't an opportunity you could actually walk into somebody's house. I'm going to use the US as an example. You could walk into somebody's house, by virtue of which news channel they turn on, you know exactly where you are. Okay. And I would actually advocate, if you are red, listen to blue channels. And if you're blue, listen to red, just so you get an understanding and you're leaning into that point of view. Because if you are constantly in the echo chamber and only listening to people who parrot your own ideas, you are losing an awful lot of learning opportunities.
I think that's a really good point, not just from a political standpoint, but from a business standpoint.
Oh, God, yeah.
Because there are so many that surround themselves only with like thinkers. And by doing that, the lack of diversity of thought does not help us to improve or grow.
One other thing I'd say, and in terms of the amount of time you spend with people, so I make a very big effort to devote time to others. I refer to them as random coffees. And I, pardon the language of this, but I refer to myself quite clearly as an absolute coffee whore. All right. I will meet anybody. The charge for a discussion with me is a flat white, pure and simple. All right. I'll meet anybody for a flat white, virtually or in person.
Y'all heard it here.
You heard it. And within reason, I have no problem giving somebody 20 minutes, half an hour to have a chat, to bounce an idea off. Because guess what? I know that if I'm actually going to use my 2 ears and use them intelligently over the 20 to 30 minutes, I'm actually going to learn something that I didn't know in the meeting. And I've learned some weird and wonderful stuff from situations where I'd never have expected it, from people I would never have interacted with, if I didn't respond and say, yeah, I'll give you 20, 30 minutes. So that to me is a crucial thing, is devote time to others, and particularly other people you haven't met yet. They're not your friend yet, but give them a chance. They're not your business acquaintance yet, but give them a chance. And maybe they have an opinion you haven't heard yet, so give it a chance. And I'd say, the key thing there is don't worry about possible red herrings. You'll hear some of the most amazing SH1T that you've ever heard in your whole lifetime. But guess what? It gives you a better opportunity to actually assess good stuff from bad stuff. Okay, so your BS detector is actually, all you're doing is you're modifying and polishing your BS detector.
That detector is what you're doing.
There you go. And then the last one is a very obvious one, is always be networking. Always be networking. But also, don't always network the way everybody else does. I'll give you one crazy example. One of the things I used to love doing when I went to conferences, was spending as much time in the exhibitors area to see which people were going to which exhibits, and eavesdropping on conversations, because you get a better sense as to the why people are there. Like, for example, I know why I'm there, and it's more than likely going to be conferences where I would know some of the speakers and I'd have a fair idea of the content. What I'm much more interested in is finding out why other people are there and who else is selling stuff. So one of the first remote work conferences that I went to, once the pandemic restrictions were lifted, what blew me away were the number of fractional insurance products that were out there, the number of people who were out there selling offsite as a service. They're basically, you can go essentially buy, and you can go to companies that actually produce offsites for companies. There were tons of companies doing employer of record as a product, so that you could actually basically expand the borders. All of these were enabling remote work, and I learned more watching the interactions, where I thought I knew quite a bit. So to me, it's networking, but in a weird way.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today. If people wanted to reach out to you, first off, why would they reach out to you? And secondly, how would they reach out to you?
I really don't care why. If somebody thinks something I said set off an idea in their mind and they had a question to ask, that's good enough for me. The easiest way to reach me is on LinkedIn. And I think we're going to put it in the program notes, but I'm fairly easy to find on LinkedIn. And that's the easiest way. Other than that, I'm not particularly interested in giving out my personal email address or mobile phone number or anything like that. Just
don't worry, LinkedIn. I'll put that in there anyway. 2 a.m. is his favorite time to get calls.
Oh, yeah. And please remember the time zones. And please remember that I actually prefer asynchronous communication. For that, I'm going to reverse what I said earlier on. For this, email actually is a highly appropriate way.
There you go. So we will have a
but
link.
when I give it to you,
There you go.
rather than me posting it up on a website.
We will absolutely have a link to John's LinkedIn, as well as he is on several boards, and we'll have links to all of those organizations and the company boards that he is on. John, thanks again. Appreciate it. And we will see all of you next week on Unexpected Journey. As we wrap the episode up, we would like to take this time to thank you for joining us this week on Unexpected Journey. Our guest information will be linked in the episode description, along with a link to our company website, remoteevolution.com, and our host website. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on your favorite podcast app and on our YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode and we can continue to bring them to you in the comments section. And once again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again next week for another episode of Unexpected Journey.